I'm a research fellow at the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. We're going to be discussing the political economy of development today. And we have Dr. Noaman Ghazanfar, who's assistant professor of political economy at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. We also have Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar, political economy assistant professor at Quaid-e-Azam University. The objective of setting up this webinar was to problematize conventional notions of development, sort of highlighting the incentive structures and political dynamics undergirding the process, and sort of coming up with a strategy, a pathway for a sustainable and democratic alternative to the process. The way development is structured today is such that it benefits a small elite around the world, where the entire process is sort of conceived as an apolitical project, a sort of technocratic project that seeks to enhance the quality of people's lives in a top-down, decontextualized, rigid sort of manner. And so we want to challenge that. We want to come up with an alternative that is sort of geared towards long-term structural change, rather than a sort of opportunistic, pragmatic approach. So I guess we can start with Dr. Noaman. Sir, can you hear me?
Yes, Abbas, I can hear you.
Sure, go ahead, sir.
Am I speaking in English or in Urdu?
However you prefer, sir.
Okay, so first let me say that I'm quite honored to have been invited. So thank you to Nadeem Saab and Aasim, to Abbas for hosting me. And of course, I'm honored to be alongside Dr. Aasim. It's been a while since we've met. So thank you for having us. I think I understand that this is going to be a bit of an informal discussion. So it's not that I've necessarily prepared a talk, but I have some thoughts about how we need to understand Pakistan's position in the world and what we mean when we're talking about development in Pakistan. So I think the first thing that we should probably clarify for ourselves is how we want to define the concept of development. And in order to do that, we need to understand a little bit about how the mainstream idea or measurements of development go. And usually what we're looking at is GDP, the gross domestic product, and then we divide that by the number of people in our country, GDP per capita. And we might look at Bangladesh and we might say, okay, देखो Bangladesh का जो GDP per capita है वो पाकिस्तान से बेहतर है, या हम भारत की तरफ देखते हैं, we look at India and we say कि भारत के पास एक बेहतर GDP per capita है. And then we look at Pakistan and we say Pakistan is not keeping up. What's the problem here? But there may be some questions that we want to ask ourselves if that is the best way that we want to define development, which is simply looking at aggregate income divided by the number of people in a country, and looking at income also in this particular kind of quantitative way with a measure that we're not really sure all the time what GDP is measuring and whether or not we all agree on what GDP is measuring across countries. The issue with GDP per capita also is that it doesn't ask the question that I think Abbas you started with, which is what is the distribution of income and then what is the distribution of wealth in a country. So we can look at GDP per capita in Bangladesh and we can say, dekho, Pakistan se nisbatan behtar hai. But what we're not asking is what is the structure of that GDP per capita? How is it being produced? Who is benefiting from it and who's not benefiting from it? In what ways? So I think that's one thing that we need to start thinking about development in a different way. And if I could propose something, for example, if we thought about development and we measured it in terms of, kya Pakistan mein har fard ke paas munasib ghaza hai? Does everybody have adequate food, culturally appropriate and nutritional food? Rehne ke liye jagah hai? And roti kapda makan in a different way, and to not necessarily conflate this or to simply think that this is going to be achieved by putting more money in people's pockets, which, by the way, we're not even clear that that is exactly what's happening in Pakistan. So I think that's one thing in terms of how do we conceptualize development, just to start a conversation going on that. The other point I'd like to make, and then I'll let hopefully Dr. Aasim say more. He's my senior and he has far more experience and knowledge than I have. But the other thing I think we need to understand or think about when we're talking about development in Pakistan, aside from how we define development, is to understand some of the structures that are at play. And I think Dr. Aasim has a lot to say about this, so I want to focus maybe a little bit on the international structures. Abbas, as you said in opening this, that we have to think about structural change and what is maybe holding us back, or what is, it's not simply a question of what's holding us back. I was looking at Dr. Nadim's book yesterday, his book Looking Back, and I think something in there he says that resonated with me, where he says, when we talk about development in Pakistan or in other places, we talk about a series of lacks. You lack this, you don't have this much GDP per capita, you don't have this much education, you don't have this. How are we going to fill those lacks? We're not looking instead at what exists, what is there, what are the structures that are facilitating a certain kind of political economy. And at the international level, I think what we have to try and better understand is what is Pakistan's position in an international division of labor. आलमी तौर पर आप कह सकते हैं कि तक़सीम मेहनत हो या तक़सीम पैदावार हो, division of production, division of labor. What is the position that Pakistan occupies in that international division of labor? We sometimes talk about it in terms of global value chains or what's Pakistan's international competitiveness. But I think we can change the language there and think of an international division of labor and think of what are the structural factors that maintain Pakistan within that division of labor, and what are the agential factors, and by agential I mean what are the domestic political economy factors. But there are international political economy factors, and that includes that, for example, Pakistan is a labor reserve for the Gulf countries and for other countries, but mainly for the Gulf countries. That labor reserve also includes military services that we provide to those countries. But by and large, we're a source of cheap labor for the Gulf countries. We are a source of cheap clothing for other countries. And although it's cheap for other countries, it's clothing that our people cannot afford. आप किसी भी गरीब बंदे से, आप किसी भी मजदूर से, किसी भी किसान से आप जाके पूछ लें, जब वो काम कर रहा है खेत में या कहीं खड़ा हुआ है, सिक्योरिटी गार्ड से आप पूछ लें, बैंक के सामने खड़े हैं कि आप क्या पहन रहे हैं, what are you wearing? And they'll tell you we're wearing polyester. So our own people cannot afford the things that we produce and put out into the world. Or for the Gulf, we make a lot of livestock. How many people in Pakistan are eating beef on a daily basis or on a weekly basis or a monthly basis? My guess is not the majority. So our entire economy is actually, or much of our economy is structured outward, especially the formal economy, if you want to call it that. So what keeps that there is not, so when we're talking about international division of labor, we need to understand that it's not simply choices that are being made in Pakistan. That's part of it, but it's also choices that are being made internationally. And then we can also talk about things like debt, structural adjustment programs, IMF, World Bank, and things like that. So I think those are two things that I'd like to maybe start off the discussion with. How do we conceive of development, and how do we conceive of Pakistan's place in an international division of labor? And what are the kind of structural factors? What are the external factors keeping it there? And then what are the internal factors is something we can talk about more. Thank you.
Great. Sir, just before moving on to Dr. Aasim, I just wanted to ask you a quick question about, so you've talked a little bit about quantitative indicators being sort of prioritized when we assess development processes around the world, quantitative over sort of structural, qualitative ones. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways of thinking about how we want to measure development. And I'm not saying that GDP per capita is a completely useless metric. I think there's a lot of things that you can think about in terms of that. But it also masks a lot of things. So for, Samir Amin, who's a very important political economist of the Global South, he talks about how, if you look at Pakistan's GDP per capita today, and let's say, I'm not sure what it is exactly, but let's say it's $1,500 US, then in a mainstream kind of economic perspective, we might look at France 100 years ago and say, look, France 100 years ago, its GDP per capita was 1,500 USD. And now today, Pakistan's is 1,500 USD, which means that Pakistan is 100 years behind France. And we simply need to do X, Y, Z so that we can catch up to France. And the X, Y, Z is often a bunch of, we need to adopt trade, we need to deregulate certain markets, we need to do this, we need to do that. There's a whole host of policy prescriptions which are coming sometimes often from agencies like the IMF and World Bank. And that once we pursue these kinds of things, we're going to do what France did. We often don't ask questions about really what was the structure of France's economy? What was France doing? What role did France occupy in international division of labor at that time? And at that time, France was, and it still is, an imperialist power. And at that time, Pakistan was colonized. And right now, I would argue that Pakistan is still not independent. It's still not an independent country. So if we don't have control over our own economics and our own political economy, what are we supposed to be? How are we supposed to get to where France got? I mean, we have to ask whether or not we even want to get to where France got. That's a different question. And I don't think we should. The other thing that stuff like GDP per capita or saying we just need to achieve this kind of quantitative measure, and this goes again to the question of how we should conceive of development, is that for us, especially in Pakistan right now, we may not contribute to climate change as much as other people, but we are going to face its consequences worse than most other countries will, just because of how we're nestled between the ocean and the Himalayas, between the mountains and the ocean. Every possible impact of climate change that you can imagine, Pakistan will probably face it. So we have to start thinking about development, not simply in terms of what's your GDP per capita, but in terms of what is our ecological, what is our relationship to the ecology and what is the ecology's relationship to us? Whether or not we like it, we're going to get hammered by it. Whether or not we even contribute to it on a global scale, we're going to get hammered by it. The other thing I think that the concept of GDP per capita often ends up masking is something we can call structural transformation in kind of classic modernization theory, which itself is a problematic notion, I was just realizing, because what we're talking about is how many of our people, what percentage of our labor force is participating in agriculture, and do you move from there to say industry and then from industry to services? So in the classic modernization theory concept, this is considered structural transformation, that you're actually moving your economy from one that is largely dependent on agriculture to one that is more dependent on industrialization, where you're going from a peasant-based economy to a proletarian or a working class or an industrial-based economy. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And we should talk about industrialization and Pakistan's problems in the industrialization if we get a chance today. But what ends up happening is that then we look at the latest labor force survey, and we might say, dekho ke the number of people in agriculture has gone down from 42%. Sorry, the percentage, the proportion of people in agriculture has gone down from 42% to 37%, and the proportion of people in industry, in manufacturing, has increased by 2 or 3%. Therefore, we are making progress according to structural transformation. But that's masking a whole series of questions. What is the relationship between agriculture and industry in Pakistan? What is the nature of work that people are doing in Pakistan? We might measure that people have more income in one way, but we also understand that people's purchasing power has decreased. We also understand that people's ability to buy necessities of life has decreased somehow. There's a paradox in India. It is possibly true of Pakistan as well, that even though incomes are increasing in much of India, people's caloric intake is decreasing. What's going on there, why that's happening? I think we can probably point to similar trends in Pakistan, but we simply don't have enough data. But we can probably point to similar trends. We're not explaining those kinds of things. And you're not going to understand those kinds of things simply by looking at GDP per capita. So what is the relationship between different sectors in our economy, in our political economy? What is the relationship between what people are doing in agriculture? If people are leaving agriculture, is that a good thing? I'm not sure that that's such a good thing. And that's not something that's going to be captured in the GDP per capita, or even the concept of structural transformation when you're looking at it as a purely quantitative notion of how many people are working in what kind of sector. So those are some thoughts on the limitations of quantitative metrics. And at least I'm not saying that we shouldn't be using quantitative metrics or that we shouldn't be quantifying things, but we need to have a better debate on what we're quantifying, how we're quantifying it, how we even know that the data we have is useful, and whether or not these concepts of development are the kinds of concepts that we should be having.
Sir, just one more. So one of the ways we're told that countries and nations can progress structurally and in a sort of like cultural way as well is through international trade, to get rid of subsidies, to open up the market, to focus on our resource endowments, and to double down on that. Is that true? What do you think are the sort of problems with that way of thinking?
the thing is that, resource endowments, or rather, if we want to talk about it in terms of comparative advantage, is that I think sometimes we come to think of comparative advantage as something that's a given. This is the structure of economy, therefore these are the kinds of things you should be focusing on. What we're not necessarily focusing on is that comparative advantage is often constructed, that it has to be nurtured, often by an activist state, or what we might call a developmental state. And that means that you cannot simply and blindly adopt questions of free trade, free markets, etc. You actually need to block free trade in some cases. Now, the problem with Pakistan's economy is that the way that free trade is blocked, or the way that regulations are imposed, are done in a parasitic manner and not necessarily in a productive one. We can get into some details around that, but it's not simply a thing about international trade. The mantra hai ki international trade is going to fix everything. The other side of that is that foreign investment is going to fix everything. And that all we, I was reading the other day about how we need to reduce our dependence on the import of edible oils. So Pakistan imports, up to $2 billion, $2 billion US dollars worth of edible oil every year annually. So, I mean, if we're talking about the structure of Pakistan, the division of labor, or the division of labor and where Pakistan resides in that, then we have to look at our plates. खाने में जो हम लोग खा रहे हैं, हमारी ग़िज़ा की तरफ हम देखें, तो इसकी ये जो तेल हम इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं, वो कहीं बाहर से आ रहा है. उसके लिए हम बहुत कीमती तेल है. It's very expensive. It's not cheap. It's cheap on an individual level, but on an aggregate level to our economy, it's not. So we're saying we need to import substitute for oil, but we're saying what we're going to have to do is rely on foreign investors to invest in the oil industry, or to invest in oilseed production of a certain kind, so that we can do this. And this is the kind of thing that a political economist named Joseph Hanlon, he calls a cargo cult. कि आप इंतजार कर रहे हैं कि बाहर से लोग आएंगे और हमें देंगे कुछ. If we want to compare ourselves, Prime Minister Imran Khan compares ourselves constantly to China, or even to India, if we want to go there, then we have to look at that a lot of their growth, and now I'm using a quantitative metric that I'm not necessarily in line with, a lot of their growth is driven by domestic investment. It's not driven by foreign investment. Foreign investment is used strategically, tactically, but especially in China, whatever their ruling class has determined to be their interests, the question of foreign trade, foreign investment, international trade is subordinated to that. I think we can move beyond that as well and go back to a point that I was making earlier. TK, international trade is important. I don't think that we can simply cut it out, but I do think we need to look at, again, Samir Amin, I'm going to bring him up, and his concept of delinking. And what delinking means is that the motive force of your economy, the motive force of your political economy needs to be driven by your own interests and what is going to be good for the majority of people in your country. It cannot be driven by what is good for other countries, and as a subordinate thought, maybe what is good for Pakistan. We've seen over the last 70 years that the way that international trade has been structured, and Pakistan has been structured in it, is not good for Pakistan. It keeps us on a constant debt trap. Part of the problem there is we're not interested in making things for our own people. हम अपने लोगों के लिए नहीं बनाते चीज़ें. Again, I brought up the examples of livestock and textile. And the reason I'm bringing those up is because textile is probably Pakistan's major industry. It imports, we imported $2.3 billion worth of cotton last year, imported that instead of growing it ourselves. And then we use that to make cotton, that textiles that we're going to export to other people. Or at best, हम जैसे middle class के लोग, upper middle class के लोग, अमीर लोग cotton पहन सकते हैं, आम आदमी पाकिस्तान का नहीं पहन सकता. We're importing $2 billion worth of oil seeds. Most of that is soybean. Most of that is being used in the livestock industry to grow livestock, which most people in Pakistan cannot eat and won't eat. It's for dairy that is being commercialized and being sold to middle class and upper class consumers. Not sure how much dairy we export. I don't think enough. But so then we have to understand that we have an economy, at least in the formal sense, that is oriented towards luxury and export. It's not oriented towards fulfilling the needs of a domestic market. Because if you want your own people to be able to buy those things, you have to start asking questions about what is it going to take to raise the incomes of our own people, their purchasing power, and not subordinating that to some idea that international trade karo sab kuch theek ho jayega. We have a huge domestic market in Pakistan, potentially 200 million people. and let's say, 100 million of them are too young to buy anything, but still 100 million people is an enormous domestic market, which we're not interested in developing. How do we develop that? By raising people's incomes so that they can actually buy things that we are producing ourselves. And then we can think about how do we engage in international markets. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but our entire thought process is how do we engage in international markets so that it can benefit us? We need to be thinking about how can we engage in domestic processes of production and circulation and trade, and then think about how we can benefit from that on an international market. And those are maybe two different ways of thinking about things, especially in this day and age, when we have to deal with questions of climate change, but also now of disrupted supply chains as a consequence of pandemic and other stuff like that.
Great. So Dr. Aasim, you've written quite a bit about the development process, especially domestically. You've written about anti-encroachment drives in the informal urban market. You've written about this movement towards financialization in the global capitalist system. You've written about private contractors and so on. How do you think we can redefine the development process in Pakistan?
That's answer that sort of requires a very long answer. First of all, thank you for having me, and to Noaman as well for his kind words at the outset. Look, I think it's probably useful for me to carry on from where Noaman left off, and maybe actually just add a little bit. I mean, I think that thinking about contemporary development processes in Pakistan or sort of other comparative contexts, I think is also an historical endeavor, right? Is also something that requires us to think about different sort of eras. Let's just say in the recent past, let's say post-independence. And I think the contemporary era is sort of, if we broadly trace it back to the end of the Cold War, and we say, okay, a 30-year conjuncture, what's shifted, quite noticeably and I think substantially, and in terms of structural, the language that Noaman was using, structural transformation, is, as you just noted, is globally and in Pakistan, is a definitive sort of shift towards financialization, right? So what this means is it could be agriculture, it could be what we thought of as sort of the horizon of industrialization. All of this is now in some ways subservient to logics of essentially global financial flows. So what we call hot capital comes in and out of countries, partly because we've allowed that to be the case. I think that's why I meant we should delve a little bit into history, because prior to this particular conjuncture, the period broadly from the time of independence through to, let's say, the early to mid 70s, was one in which states like ourselves, no matter how beholden we were to sort of dominant development fashions, nevertheless there was sort of greater control over charting what should be some autonomous economic or developmental paths, and over the last 30 years, that has, to whatever extent we did have any autonomous direction to our developmental sort of visions, that's been greatly eroded, and I'll say by choice. I won't say this is sort of simply just an imposition from above or from whether it be financial institutions, whether it be private creditors, whatever it may be. It's something that our ruling elites and successive regimes, mind you, have acceded to. And I think what that means is the kinds of questions that Noaman has raised become even more acute. They were acute even before. Sort of the classic modernization theory to which he was referring, those were question marks that even could have been raised in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s about the extent to which there's this sort of linear or teleological move from, an agrarian to an industrial structure, and the fact that that is largely beneficial for all, and so on and so forth. Those were questions that could and were raised even then. Now, what we find is, and some of the work that I've done that you've just referred to reflects that, right? So for instance, the suburbanization processes in which massive gated housing schemes are swallowing up both agricultural land and therefore accelerating a process of depeasantization or what some literatures will call the production of surplus populations, where because these people who are swallowed up by these massive gated housing schemes don't necessarily have, let's say, factories that absorb them in the cities where they're forced to move, as we assumed perhaps maybe 40 or 50 years ago would be the case when structural transformations of the kind that Noaman was referring to, at least in textbook theory, would take place. So you have essentially, even then there were surplus populations, there was a reserve army of labor that was being generated because industry still had limited absorptive capacity compared to the numbers of people displaced and that's why, for instance, so many people rely on exporting themselves. Pakistan's biggest export is labor, as Noaman rightfully pointed out, right? So you basically have to go abroad and work a menial labor job in the Gulf, because that's your best option, really. And that those sort of opportunities, of course, have dried up again when you think about kinds of population pressures. We don't have absorption by manufacturing industry, even though Noaman noted that labor force, I think survey says, I think something like it's gone up by 2 or 3 percentage points, manufacturing, 2020 to 24, something like that. But on the whole, the service sector is exploding through the roof. And the service sector, mind you, if you look at our demographic and labor force profile, up to 40% of Pakistan's labor force is self-employed. So essentially, that means ready lagana, that means chota mota hotel lagana, and that is not really accounted for in the classic modernization theories, right? There was an assumption that you'd have a sort of shift from agriculture to industry, and what we found over successive generations, and as I said, with financialization, it's just intensifying, is that those proportions, those were disproportionate sort of shifts. So the number of people being displaced from agriculture were never fully absorbed into manufacturing industry, even in the heyday of, let's say, import substitution. And now that's, all rhetoric notwithstanding, that, there will be, what was it, 10 million jobs? It was 5 million homes and 10 million jobs, or something a bit like, preposterous enough that I don't even need to remember exactly what the figure was. And that, aside from that rhetoric, the fact is, if you have a deep dive into, the political economy story, you'll find that there was never sort of that kind of absorptive capacity even 30 years ago, and now the numbers of people being displaced from agriculture are growing or increasing, from not just from agriculture, from people who rely on water bodies. You've seen recently that Gwadar, the crown jewel of CPEC, is beset by all sorts of protests by fishing communities because there's no electricity, they're being displaced from their traditional livelihoods. So this can extend beyond just agriculture. Oman made some mention of livestock rearing and so on. People who rely on, communities who rely on forests to meet their livelihoods. All of this is being displaced, and we have no sort of vision, to be quite honest with you, of how to address that. And that then, those exclusions and those displacements, often violent, are then also play out in the urban metropole, right? Where surplus populations come to settle. Mandi mein jaakar wholesale की सब्जी लेकर एक बंदा रेडी लगाता है पूरा दिन और मंडी के साथ कच्ची आबादी में रहता है, और फिर हम उस कच्ची आबादी को भी बुलडोज करते हैं. हम कभी कभार उस रेडी को भी उसको किसी जगह खड़ा नहीं होने देते. So these are essentially what this reflects. A is a lack of vision, frankly, even understanding of your own sort of story, insofar as these things are not talked about. And B, a lack of political will. So even if this is acknowledged at whatever level of officialdom, what we do when we engage in anti-encroachment operations, so to speak, so-called encroachments, because let me not get into the big encroachers and the elite encroachers who no one ever makes mention of. So we selectively apply the rule of law, we bulldoze their homes and their whatever limited livelihoods, and then we expect them to disappear somehow. कि शायद ज़मीन उनको खा जाएगी। जब जिस पेपर का आप शायद हवाला दे रहे थे 2015 में, एक बहुत बड़ी कोई तकरीबन 20-25 हज़ार लोगों पर मुश्तमिल एक कच्ची आबादी को सब्जी मंडी के साथ जब बुलडोज किया गया, तो मुझे याद है सीडीए के एक अच्छे खासे अफसर के साथ मेरी मतलब बहस हुई, तू मैं ही कह लें हो गई, और उन्होंने कहा जी उनको कहो वापस अपने गांव चले जाएं. I mean, this is the kind of both vision and will that we have, not being willing to accept कि वो गांव से अपनी मर्जी से शायद उस वक्त भी नहीं आए थे. These are structural, as we've talked about, displacements. So there's a whole totality of relationships, as Noaman says, starting from the global down to the very local. And as I say, I think historicizing development, and I'll just, this little segment, I'll just close by saying 30 or 40 years ago, I think there was within some kind of progressive nationalist bent within third world countries, Pakistan may or may not have had a lot of it, in which, you talked about the G77, you talked about a new international economic order, you talked about structural change at the global level to try and inform some kind of, redistribution of wealth and opportunities, which would in principle would have been consonant with your actually existing reality on the ground, rather than based on some textbook notion, which perhaps arguably never really was that accurate in depicting the reality of third world countries to begin with.
Sir, you mentioned the concept of accumulation by dispossession, which I believe is David Harvey's concept in your paper, which for everyone interested is called Dispossession and the Militarized Developer State, for anyone who wants to look into it. Sir, can you elaborate a little bit on that concept? Can you explain it?
Yeah, happily. When essentially, related to what I started off with, this sort of idea does two things basically. Well, it does many things, but I will just highlight two. First, it emphasizes this structural global shift in terms of global, and it's worth using the word global capitalism, because when we talk development, we are largely talking within the confines of capitalist development. So in the global capitalist order, this notion of accumulation by dispossession that Harvey deployed sought to depict precisely how financialization and sort of hot capital bubbles, asset bubbles, have become increasingly dominant in sort of structuring the profit motive, or in conditioning the profit motive. And that then requires a process of accumulating capital or generating profit via dispossession, right? So as opposed to the classical industrial form where you set up a factory and at least some of that trickles down, some of the benefits of capitalist development trickle down via some kind of job creation. By accumulation by dispossession simply means land grabs. It means kicking people out of work. It means, corporatizing health and education, which again, in the bygone era used to be conceived as public goods that all citizens of a country should have, free or at least subsidized access to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that it does, I think, which is very important, is historicizes development, right? It also tells us, which again, maybe Harvey does that less, but what I'm more interested in, I'm sure Noaman would concur, it historicizes that in countries like ours, previously colonized countries, where we still have a lot of rentier logics that inform, or a lot of even neo-imperial logics that inform the way we relate to the world, including like the question of our labor force and how it performs slave labor in other parts of the world. Accumulation by dispossession is something, or a concept, that allows us to understand that historically in our societies, we've always had these phenomena. Land grabs are not something that just began. They've been intensified, certainly, which is what I said earlier, in the last 30 years. But if you look at sort of colonial rule, it was full of sort of processes where, certain allies of the colonial state were enfranchised and other populations were disenfranchised, criminalized, labeled dangerous classes, given caste identities like non-agricultural, which essentially meant that they couldn't own property, right? So these are long-term historical processes. And I think it's important to understand that there's been ebbs and flows in the extent to which sort of primary accumulation or primitive accumulation or accumulation by dispossession has, the kind of centrality it has occupied in different conjunctures, more or less. And the argument goes that in the last 30, 40 years, it's intensified greatly. But I do wish to sort of reiterate that it's not as if these sorts of processes are entirely novel and have no precedent until more recently. So that's a short primer on accumulation by dispossession.
Great. Sir, I just wanted to ask you one more thing. So what do you think the role of land reform is in this entire process? Because in Pakistan, we've attempted land reform a couple of times in the past, unsuccessfully. How do you think we can reconceptualize land reform and do it in a more effective way that is sort of more democratic in its nature?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I mean, look, I think, again, this goes back to the earlier point I made about will, right? I think that the question is will, first and foremost. Is there the will? I think the modalities then are specific questions, and I'll get to them. But I do want to emphasize this question of will. In the heyday, as I said, of a sort of a different conjuncture of developmental visions of the 60s and 70s, that's when the land reform legislations or the land reform sort of whatever initiatives that we've seen in this country took place. And to be quite honest, Noaman is better equipped to talk about this because he's written his dissertation about arguably the biggest peasant movement that this country has ever seen in Hashtnagar, in Charsada and Nadan. And I think that's important, right? Because it was the fact that there was a demand from below that, in some ways compelled rulers, both military and civilian, right? Because the first one was under Ayub Khan, to undertake such measures. There was also this grand modernization logic that we were talking about. कि अगर आप यानी कि बड़ी जिम्मेदारियां खत्म करेंगे तो फिर उसके नतीजे में ज़रात भी ज़्यादा एफिशिएंट होगी, कैपिटलिस्टिक उसके अंदर इफेक्ट्स बढ़ेंगे, टेक्नोलॉजी आएगी और फिर वो structural transformation towards industry will sort of be accelerated. But there was also a political dimension कि जो गरीब है, जो बेज़मीन है या जो छोटा किसान है, उसका भी हक है. That is conspicuous by its absence. So I think without that, then we can have in some ways, philosophical discussion about it. But I think that's an important point to bear in mind. All of these questions of development ultimately do come down to will, vision and will. As regards to what one would actually posit as sort of a meaningful sort of contemporary agenda for land reform, I think I would just suggest that we need to extend the idea of land reform to urban and peri-urban spaces as well, right? Because if suburbanization, if financialization is taking place, and sort of thinking about land reform also within the context of larger ideas of nature and natural resources, right? So water bodies and the commons, what we call the commons, right? And sort of thinking about the commons also as something that contemporary and future generations of ordinary working class Pakistanis also have an entitlement. So in a sense, there's the old bit about certain kinds of ceilings to land, taxing agricultural income, creating opportunities for people on the margins, smallholders. Mind you, a lot of smallholders now simply cannot till their lands. They lease out some of their lands because they just cannot operate at the scale that big, sort of even middle-sized or capitalist farmers do. So, their land reform also has to be accompanied by some sort of larger understanding of, credit markets, perhaps forms of cooperative farming that can help people, farm at scale, and urban land reform, right? because when you look at these big gated housing schemes and you look at real estate is an industry in our paper we quoted is valued at $220 trillion, in terms of sort of its value. And in Pakistan, it is not completely, but largely untaxed, unregulated, and so without a land reform agenda that also encompasses that sort of land, which of course now is of so much value and which engenders so much dispossession, I think we'll be missing a bit of the boat.
Great. Dr. Noaman, do you want to add anything to the question of land reform?
A little bit. I think Aasim has covered the most important things. So maybe 2 or 3 points on that. I think land reform has to be understood, as Aasim said, not simply as land reform, but as agrarian reform. If we're going to talk about it in a rural setting, that what is it that is squeezing small producers out and making this something that is a game of larger producers? To that, we should add questions about efficiency and stuff like that. So for some people, the question of land reform is no longer applicable. And the reason they would argue that is that big landowners don't really exist anymore. These things have been broken up into smaller units. And if you break them up into even smaller units, then you're going to have inefficiencies in agricultural production. I'm not sure that either of those things are true. So it's certainly true that there is a lot of kind of splitting of land units into smaller ones, but we also see that there's greater concentration of land ownership at the top of the distribution. So that's one thing that we need to be very attuned to, that there is an incredible inequality in land ownership in Pakistan, both in rural settings and in urban settings. As Aasim said very rightly, that we need to think about land reform as an urban question as well. The other part of that then is that instead of talking about land reform, the IMF and World Bank have an agenda of land markets, not land reform, land markets, where ideally that land will go to the most efficient producer. And when we think about efficiency in those terms, so Harun Akram Lodi has a great paper that I think is worth reading on agroecology and the question of, is large-scale farming actually efficient? And this goes back to some of the earlier questions we were talking about. By some metrics, yes. So if you're looking at, for example, yields per hectare, or if you're looking at yields per worker, then you can say, yes, it's in some ways more efficient. Not always, though yields per hectare can often be greater when you have smaller farmers, small-scale farmers. And those are, the question is under what conditions? And is the Pakistani government or our Pakistani ruling classes thinking about what are the conditions under which we can make small-scale agriculture more efficient? The other question, though, is once you include questions of ecology and ecological throughput and questions of energy usage, large-scale farming is not efficient. It's destructive. It's destructive towards the environment. It's driven by fossil fuels, especially when you're looking at livestock and poultry and stuff like that. So small-scale agriculture can be more productive, it can be more efficient, and it can be more ecologically efficient. But that requires a lot of thinking. It requires a lot of moving away from dogmas that are coming from the IMF and World Bank. As a consequence, if we're thinking, as Aasim was saying, that urban areas are often seen as this this kind of jadoo ki chhadi ke magic pill, right? Just put people in cities and their incomes are going to go up. Well, if we need to rethink that and think about how do we actually keep people absorbed in agriculture and do that in ecologically useful ways. So that's one question. The other question is one of something that Aasim is talking about in terms of political will, and Aasim's mentioned that a couple of times. So I think it's useful to go into this a little bit more and what do we mean by political will. First of all, a lot of our objectives are not determined through the interests of the majority of Pakistanis. Pakistani, agar hum dekh lein, the average Pakistani is probably a woman in her 20s who does not have a bank account, who does not have a job, who's or who actually may have some kind of employment now increasingly. We're not thinking, that's not the archetypal Pakistani that we're thinking about when we're thinking about who development is for and who is the Pakistani. Hamare zehen mein Pakistani ka matlab ye hota koi English speaking urban upper middle class type person is something that we think of as the average Pakistani. Even those of us who are conversing in English, which is, I started with that question. It's weird. Most Pakistanis don't speak English. Most Pakistanis don't understand English. We understand certain English words. So even our objectives are determined by the interests of not the average Pakistani. Our discussion, our discourse is not the discourse of the average Pakistani. So the question is, where does political will come from? Wo kahan se aati hai cheez? And we can look at a literature in development that's called the political settlements literature, which is that political will is an outcome of contestations and negotiations between different power blocks in society. And where I would qualify that, and I think Aasim would agree too, is that we need to understand that power blocks in society are determined by class relations. It's about class struggle. Class struggle is what determines the overall shape of political settlements, which is what determines the shape of political will, and as a consequence, policies and institutions that we have. हमारी सोच है कि आप policies और institutions को ठीक कर देंगे तो सब कुछ ठीक हो जाएगा. कैसे ठीक हो जाएगा? कौन ठीक करेगा policies और institutions को? जो मौजूदा आपकी हुक्मरान तबका है, ruling class है, they're completely uninterested. That's why they don't have a political will, because this setup, this system is benefiting them. It's good for them. We can talk about rentier logics, rent seeking, etc. But the actual question is, and this goes back to the question of Char Sadda, Madan, and peasant movement, and also other kinds of movements that Aasim has been engaged in and has studied. What kind of political power is being built amongst the average Pakistanis, Aam Pakistani, that can enable them to influence that agenda? And so long as we're not thinking about that question, that actually the question of land reform is not one of, ji ceiling ka size kya hona chahiye, or kya, isme ye kya hai, wo kya hai. Wo baat ki baatein hain. The modalities, as Aasim said, we can discuss later. The real question is, do the political interests exist? And does the political power exist to take those assets which the ruling classes in Pakistan have accumulated through dispossession and redistribute those amongst the people of Pakistan? That's the ultimate question of really any policy that we're talking about in Pakistan. And so agrarian reform is important, land reform is important. I think those are really live issues that we really need to discuss, and not simply subordinate to a question of land markets, especially as considered in those terms. But in order to have that discussion, हमें ताकत की बात करनी पड़ेगी, और सियासी ताकत किसके पास है, किसके पास नहीं है, उसकी हमें बात करनी पड़ेगी.
Great. So you've talked a little bit about a counterinsurgency strategy on the part of elites as a means for the ruling classes to sort of quell resistance. Could you elaborate a little bit on that within the context of development?
Are you asking me or are you asking Aasim?
Dr. Noaman.
Oh, because I feel like Aasim's spoken about this a lot more than I have. But
we'll go to Dr. Aasim right afterwards.
Okay, so I think this is I think we can think of this, and maybe we can have, this might be a bit of a controversial thing that I'm going to pose. We can think about the war on terror, or as we should probably refer to it, the war of terror, this war that was kind of imposed on Pakistan. And think about, again, this is something that Aasim has definitely talked about a lot more than I, but we do need to think about our primary response to fundamentalism and terrorism in this country, especially when pushed and driven. It's either apathy, either we pretend it doesn't exist normally, or we pretend that it's not a problem that it exists, or many state agencies have used it, have cultivated it. So it's either that, आप या तो एक तरफ होते हैं या दूसरी तरफ होते हैं कि बस इनको मारो, मार डालो, सबको मार डालो, कुचल डालो के इनको बमबारी करो, इन पे, bomb them out of existence, right? And there's nothing in between. There's no kind of understanding of why is it that so many people in Pakistan are turning to militancy in a certain way. Some of that is ideological, but a lot of that has to be understood as a consequence of the underdevelopment that exists in Pakistan, and specifically in places like FATA. And we don't try to understand why that underdevelopment exists in nuanced ways. We don't try to understand what it would take to change that situation. And instead, we either make use of that underdevelopment so that we have foot soldiers for whatever agenda of the day is, or we just bomb them and we treat them in the worst possible way, as if they're not Pakistanis, as if they're not humans. And so really what we're doing as a ruling class, and which I'm not part of, so I don't know why I'm saying we, is what the ruling class of the country is doing is using people in FATA and other areas in the worst possible way. And I don't know how to express this, that we don't have this. And instead of thinking about what it would mean to change things, we have these logics of counterinsurgency. How do we stamp out dissent? How do we stamp out these things? And so one thing that comes out of the war on terror, again, Aasim will speak to this much better than me, is anti-terrorism legislation, Anti-Terrorism Act, ATA, which is supposed to be used against quote unquote terrorists, whatever that means. Because I know the ATA is not being used against the people who impose this war on us. But it ends up being used against labor organizers. It ends up being used against peasant activists. It ends up being used against people who are fighting for Aam Aadmi ke liye, Aam Pakistani ke liye, Aam Insan ke liye in Pakistan. So that's the thing that I think we need to understand one thing we need to understand about the logic of counterinsurgency, that if we understand that development is not merely a question of technical policies, but it's actually a question of relations of forces between different power blocks and societies, then counterinsurgency is not merely some kind of ji hamari niyat achhi hai ki hame bas dabana hai terrorists ko phir aage chale jayenge. It's also used to stamp down on the capacity of lower classes to organize and to defend themselves. And again, I hope Aasim has something more intelligent to say.
Sure, please, Dr. Aasim, go ahead. What are your thoughts on development's linkages to war and counterterrorism?
They're substantial. I have actually just finished a book about it. So in a sense, these two signifiers in terms of terminologies, in terms of the kinds of power that those terms hold in public discourse are exactly as Noaman says. What that means is that you end up basically championing binary kinds of strategies, which is sort of like being an ostrich in the sand sort of approach. So, terrorism exists as a threat out there. Usually, of course, we have experienced it in metropolitan Pakistan, but then it is identified as something that is out there, or the cause or the root is somewhere far away. And it operates sort of in some ways to generate this sense of fear. And the fear is that our developmental future is at stake. So, in the American case, it was like they hate our way of life. In our case, it's more like sort of a middle class civility is at stake. And development sort of embodies that, right? Development. And I think what Noaman is noting is that it is not just their ideological signifiers, certainly, which, as I said earlier at the beginning, development always has been, or at least in the post-independence era, always has been. But they're also material signifiers, right? They also represent something material. So the kinds of areas that we describe as being the backwaters or havens of terrorism are generally, far less endowed. Well, they're very well endowed usually, as it turns out, but they're far less they're less integrated. The kinds of economic and social relations that statecraft has presided over for decades, centuries even, are very carrot and stick. So you have choice allies who are enfranchised, and you have the rest of society, which is generally governed by often colonial. Don't forget, FATA is a great example. 2018 में जाकर हमने FCR repeal किया, which is a really, really awful colonial era law. So these developmental logics, CPEC, I think, if we had time, we could get into, CPEC and the fact of it being, sort of focused largely on the peripheries. I mean, I just gave you the example of Gwadar. I mean, if Gwadar is the crown jewel, then why are Gwadaris raising hay or making a fuss about the fact that they're not benefiting from it? So I think that this idea of development, at least in metropolitan Pakistan, in mainstream Pakistan, often does animate sort of what we've seen, at least in the last 20 years, these blanket operations to eliminate terrorism, right? It's not the only explanation, but it's certainly that aspiration to acquire sort of a fancy home in a gated housing community can be conjoined to this fear of the other far away that threatens it. And I think that these are important, and there are parallels around the world. If you look at nearby neighboring India, a very different kind of insurgency, a Maoist insurgency, a Naxalite insurgency, has long, even before the Modi regime, it was Manmohan Singh in 2009 who called it the greatest internal security threat that India faces. If we're talking 25 to 30% of India's sort of, especially, in some ways underdeveloped rural peripheries, where accumulation by dispossession is being enforced for minerals and for forest cover and so on and so forth. And then there's an insurgency that you conveniently call terrorism and crush. Then, it's like that idea of ye log kahan jayenge, wo ghaib ho jayenge. These are communities often that have a long history of being criminalized and marginalized all the way back to the colonial era. So there's these long-term sort of trends of uneven development that underlie the kinds of, in our era, in this last 20 years, it's been terrorism. In other eras, it's been other sort of isms that have been criminalized to sort of in some ways reinforce and perpetuate long-term developmental patterns. So, these are any given example will give you different sort of variations of the theme, but there's no question. And we talked earlier about anti-encroachment. Sure, okay. If the question is of legality, then there's plenty of big fish that I can tell you. I believe all sorts, from the Prime Minister's Banigala mansion to Malik Riaz's Beria town. They're allowed to pay off their illegality and their encroachment and get it legalized, right? So these are glaring sort of, in a sense, exceptions to supposedly a rule, when in fact they are, as always, as we've already discussed, these are very much questions of politics, of power, and how these ideas are deployed to either reinforce existing trends and patterns, or in perhaps not this particular era, but certainly worth thinking about those historical eras in the interests of the majority of people.
Great. So just before moving to the floor for questions, I wanted to get your folks' thoughts on the role of politics. Development is generally conceived as a largely apolitical project, a technocratic project. What do you think is the role of things like unionization, student politics, grassroots political movements, and so on? And I guess we can start with Dr. Aasim here. You've served as the president of the infamous Awami Workers' Party. So please go ahead, sir.
I like the infamous. That's a very, very powerful adjective you've chosen.
So within PIDE, it is very infamous.
All right. Okay. Fine. Fair enough. I hear you. Look, I think to an extent we've already touched on this. That without some kind of organized strength or sort of meaningful political sway, it's certainly worth talking about, as we are doing. But the reality is that the kinds of pressures on sort of whether it's the government of the day, or let's say the state more generally, or ruling classes more generally, and that includes also a global sort of set of actors that influence and of course exercise great power within our society or on our political and economic logics. अगर उसको आपने तब्दील करना है, कुछ मुतबादल करना है, आपने ज़रिए इस्लाहात करने हैं, आपने कच्ची आबादियों को रेगुलराइज करना है, आपने रेडी बानों को हर रोज दूसरे तीसरे दिन बुलडोज होने से बचाना है, आपने whatever you want to sort of restore some kind of ideas of public service provision like health and education rather than private. All of these are substantial policy shifts that require substantial political sort of, in a sense, power or at least pressure. And you know, in the absence of, and this is a totally different debate, why our mainstream parties or even intelligentsia tends not to articulate those sorts of positions, or as you say, articulate or think about questions of development in very apolitical ways. That being the case, you do need, you know, other formations. You need, as you said, and student unions is a great example, इसलिए चूंकि पाकिस्तान में इस वक्त 65% आबादी जो है वो 23-24 साल की उम्र से कम है, और आजकल आए रोज आपको नजर आता है कि कोई ना कोई किसी तालीमी इदारे में झगड़ा हो रहा है, and there's no real meaningful way to redress those grievances. Labor unions, you know, of course, peasant collectivities. Now, ये एक अलग question है कि, you know, is this, have all of these, or to the extent that they existed, again, I'll take you back to what I said earlier, in an era not so far removed from this one, those sorts of entities and collectivities existed, and they had played a significant role in bringing, in mainstreaming agendas like land reform, right? अब वो क्या हुआ, वो repression हुआ, वो बिखर भी गए, उसमें repression का भी role है, उसमें और भी चीज़ों का role है, but certainly हमारे जैसे लोग कोशिश में तो रहते हैं to sort of restore, or sort of at least raise those agendas and sort of assert that even when you think about a democratic society or process of democratization, that doesn't simply mean having an election every few years, or just broadly ideas of civil liberties. It also means associations. It also means, you know, organizing and articulating your interests, just like corporate lobbies do, and just like big pharma lobbies do. Similarly, that principle applies to those who are unrepresented. And उसके बगैर तो कम से कम ये चीजें किसी हद तक तो आप जैसे लोगों की वजह से बहस में तो आ जाएंगी, बट उनको बहस से आगे फिर मेन स्ट्रीम में लाना और एक्चुअली पॉलिसी शिफ्ट की तरफ एक माहौल बनाना, that does require organized political force and collectivities.
Dr. Noaman, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm adding anything useful, but just to, it's interesting because the conversation started when I started out, I was talking about kid development is like, we need to rethink, you know, what are the normative objectives, यानी हमारे objectives क्या हैं, या मकासद क्या है जब हम तरक्की की बात करते हैं, development की बात करते हैं. And as it's progressed, I think it reminded me of something I said elsewhere, which is, you know, if we can think of development rather as power to the powerless, or those who have relatively less power, how are they going to gain more power? Which is, I think, what Aasim is also talking about. बुनियादी तौर पर कोई भी policy, कोई भी institutional arrangement के पीछे कोई political settlement होता है, कोई political bargain होता है. There's a political bargain behind this. And nowadays, sometimes political economy just has come to mean understanding the political bargain that underlies institutional arrangements or policies. And that's important. It's important to understand then a particular policy, what kind of balance of forces is necessary to change it. नुमाइंदगी की जो बात कर रहे हैं आसिम साहब के जी, पाकिस्तानी mainstream discourse जो है, बातचीत जो है, गुफ्तगू जो है, उसमें नुमाइंदगी ही नहीं है, और काफ़ी हद तक नुमाइंदगी नहीं है जो आम इंसान पाकिस्तान के अंदर या आम लोग हैं. और आम लोग से मुराद मेरा ये नहीं है, it's not to say that there's only one kind of person in Pakistan. We also have a diversity of people in Pakistan. Ethnic, linguistic, gender-based diversities also exist, but the majority of Pakistanis belong to working class and poor peasant kind of backgrounds in class terms, or, you know, they're surplus populations, as Aasim has said, and their interests are not represented. So I think that we need to also think beyond, especially when we're thinking about development or what does development mean. It's not simply कि इस policy में क्या reflection है of lower class interests or things like that. That's certainly important. But if we want to think about the challenges that face us as Pakistan, which is we've got all kinds of fragmentation within our society. We're facing climate change, we're facing pandemics, of course, we have constant balance of payment problems, then we have to understand that it's not simply a question of okay, is policy or us policy ko change karo, or tinkering around with the margins, which a lot of development has now become about. Okay, like if we randomize control trials and stuff like that, कि हम इस चीज को थोड़ा सा इधर से इधर change करेंगे तो फिर क्या effect होगा उसका, and then that's you get a Nobel Prize for that, or some kind of thing, which is fine. I'm certainly not saying that anything I've done is deserving of Nobel Prize, nor will it ever be. But the fact that this is what mainstream development discourse has become is about tinkering at the margins, rather than asking, what does it mean to have a state project, a political economic project in its totality, mukammal taur par, which is determined by the interests of the working classes and the peasants, the poor peasants, and those sections of society. It's not about one or two policies here and there and tinkering around it and asking for what would it mean to assert that? And obviously that's a huge task, that's a huge question. But I think that is really the question of development. It's actually the question of power to the powerless, which then enables their interests to be the ones that are guiding policy, but really guiding statecraft and the development of state. So ultimately it does, I think, come down to a question of state power as well.
All right, so I guess we can turn to the audience here. I know we have some heavyweights in the audience here, intellectually, I mean, not physically. Dr. Umair Javed, it's been a while, sir. I hope you're doing well. Please go ahead.
Sorry, thanks. I wasn't able to unmute myself. Thanks, Abbas. I'm well. I hope you are too. Thank you, Aasim, Noaman, for a great conversation and some really interesting points here. The question that I wanted to ask is directed towards Noaman and has a little bearing to what was being discussed in the last, I guess, 15-20 minutes. But something that sort of Noaman started off with, which was what would a pathway to development broadly conceived actually look like for Pakistan? And that sort of, it's something that we've had conversations about, and it's something that continues to dominate sort of, economic discourse in this country. And one of the things that sort of you mentioned was that we need to start conceptualizing a development pathway that looks at sort of the strengths of Pakistan as a domestic economy, right? Looking at the population, looking at raising living standards for its own people. And I feel like I agree with that, and I think that's a sort of it's a good way of thinking about it. What I often struggle with, and this is where I'm hoping you can sort of provide some clarity or at least some some certainty, is how do we conceptualize such a pathway in the short or the medium term, where the economy is still sort of integrated with the global economy and is sort of largely dependent on trade for things like its dollar requirement, and that's one of the perennial crises that the Pakistani sort of economy faces on a regular basis, right? Which is that we simply don't make enough dollars to buy the stuff that the country needs to grow at any rate, let alone a high growth rate. So I'm curious to see how drastic you think the state can actually act when it comes to something like that, and how sort of long would an adjustment period actually look like, where we sort of disentangle ourselves from what are fairly sort of constrained relations with the rest of the world, or at least with international markets.
Should I answer that, or should we take some more points?
Yeah, please go ahead, sir.
I mean, Umair, that's a really good question. I don't think I have any. I don't think I have an optimistic answer for you. I'm not particularly optimistic. Matlab, short term or medium term ki jo tum log baat kar rahe hain, because it really does come down to what are the kinds of interests that are guiding that political economy, and the fact that we're so dependent on imports is, as you said, we simply don't have the dollars to pay for those imports, but we keep importing. Suggests that there are a bunch of interests involved, import-export groups, which you know much better about, but also then asking what is the structure of the stuff that's being imported, what is the structure of the stuff that's being exported, and why. That said, I think at least in some policy circles, there, whether by some force, there's some question of how we can reduce dependence on imports. But what's interesting about that is that the big ticket stuff doesn't, a lot of the big ticket stuff doesn't seem to be addressed. So I think I mentioned 2 or 3 really big ticket items. One is cotton that we import. I think over the 2020-2021 period, that's about 2.3 billion US dollars of cotton that was imported so that we could then process that cotton and export it as textiles. So even if your textile exports are increasing, they're basically offset by the imports. So who benefits from that? Certainly the textile industry benefits from that, the owners of the textile industries, and some of it trickles down to workers. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but there's losses too. Agricultural production of cotton has gone down substantially over the last few years. Part of it we can blame on climate change, but most of it, or a lot of it, we have to blame on, is there government policy that's thinking about how do we produce our own cotton? How do we do the research and development that's necessary? And Ehsan Rana, who's also at LUMS, has written a very good article about how so much of this policy is a mess. What does research and development of new kinds of cotton varieties look like? What does research and development into climate appropriate cotton production look like? And then you can talk about policy levers like support prices and stuff like that. But that discussion is reduced to a discussion on support prices. There's no real movement around this. Sugar को बड़ी subsidies मिलती हैं. Sugar mills को subsidies मिल रही हैं. But that's not really what we need in Pakistan to move beyond things. The other big ticket item I was talking about is oil, तेल, को जो हम import करते हैं, like up to $2 billion worth of edible oil is what we import from Malaysia and Indonesia. All of that is, most of that is palm oil, which is not healthy either. Instead of thinking about, is it really rocket science to produce oil? And it's not, let's just be clear, it's not, but it requires certain forms of investment and certain forms of moves. Those are not, the political bargain, political settlement or interests are not easy to fix. But to me, it seems like if you have somebody or a set of people putting their minds to it and thinking about how do we actually restructure certain agrarian policies and certain agricultural policies, perhaps we can move that in a direction that is more labor absorbing and saves Pakistan some foreign exchange. But it seems to be going in the opposite direction. Instead of thinking about how to reduce dependence on these kinds of imports, which we can potentially do if we look at our agricultural capacities and capabilities, it's going the other way. So I'm not really optimistic about short-term pathways, but I think these two things, if we look at these big ticket items, we could probably start thinking about those. And I'm really honestly at the beginning of thinking about that question. So I'm afraid कि ज़्यादा मुतमईन शायद अपनी ही मेरे जवाब से, लेकिन it's the best that I can do.
Mr. Ahmed Riaz Lodi, who's been very supportive of this initiative from its outset. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Abbas. It's more of an addition to what Noaman and Aasim were talking about earlier. It reminded me of an earlier discussion with Noaman back when he was not a doctor. We were sitting in Lahore with another mutual friend of ours, and that friend is from Waziristan. And he quoted a certain LUMS professor who I've checked now is teaching at NDU. And that teacher, that person said that it is part of the statecraft to keep certain areas underdeveloped. I think this statement sheds light on the connection or the role that the state has played, particularly when it comes to the relationship between war of terror and development. So yeah, that's it. I'd be glad if any of you, Noaman or Aasim, wants to shed more light or explore it further.
Yeah, I'm happy to just sort of jump in here just to sort of, again, offer some historical context. You're absolutely correct. I mean, I don't know who the person in question is. Maybe they actually believe this from the bottom of their heart as a good thing. But just to be reminded, this was very much the logic of colonial statecraft. I remember Mustafa Kamal Pasha's PhD dissertation was about how the Salt Range districts were kept deliberately underdeveloped. I think the title of the book was something like the political economy of underdevelopment or something like that, essentially. So as to, i.e. in the sense of not have, irrigated water and not, and because they're sort of the This was not a plain area. There was no agriculture to sustain people. And so basically, these areas, like much of Potwar, became the recruiting ground for the British Indian Army. These are not old logics. There are other examples, certainly, that one could draw on, but just to sort of concur that, you know, statecraft very much involves choosing to enfranchise and disenfranchise, and it is precisely in those more co-opted, let's say, regions where there is greater share of the spoils. Mind you, let's not forget that this has also happened on a global scale, right? So much labor militancy and even sort of revolutionary movements in Europe were often co-opted by virtue of the kinds of, imperialist extraction from the colonies, that a bit of which was allowed to trickle down to working classes in Europe and North America. And there's a long history of even sort of official, statist trade unionism, in which, you sort of ask for a little bit of the share of the spoils without doing too much politics or questioning big picture, or making big or sort of raising big questions. So there's a long history. There's many different examples of it, both historical and contemporary. And again, this goes back to what Abbas was saying earlier. The more sort of we accept and acknowledge and bring politics into the study of development, I think both in terms of intellectual honesty and in terms of thinking more meaningfully about how to integrate greater segments of society which are historically excluded, that we're going to get, we're at least better equipped to do that.
Dr. Idris Khwaja, please go ahead.
Thank you, Abbas. So it was argued that we need reforms, agreed. And then it was also argued that those in need of reforms are in power. So my question would be that how to dislodge them, and to an extent, Aasim answered it, that we need an organized political formation for this. But if we go by the view that, for example, Naya Pakistan is not so much Naya, then what is the guarantee that the reformed or developed, or whatever we called it, developed or progressive, would not reflect the situation of George Orwell's Animal Farm? That is, the new rulers would not be just like the old rulers, but in a different attire. To both, the question is.
I'll go first. I'll go first,
sure.
and Noaman can, because he's such an eternal optimist, can pick up pieces. There is no guarantee, Idrisa. I think we all, in a sense, know this. History is about contingency and about, there's no guarantees that we will necessarily have the outcome that we desire on the basis of any particular political movement with a particular vision. But I would definitely suggest, just very gently, that Naya Pakistan was never designed to be a significant, substantial project of overhauling state or society. The fact that there was a rhetoric around it, and the fact that there was, young people, especially in metropolitan Pakistan, that sort of bought into that rhetoric or became big-time supporters of that project is important, certainly, and I think that that's something we would do well to remind ourselves, that there is sort of especially because of this large demographic of young people, many of whom maybe are not ensconced in the kinds of old patronage networks that earlier generations were, at least at the level of thinking about politics or alternatives or reform. They may be more inclined to do so. But the old signifiers, we talked about development and terrorism, and of course in the case of the PTI, corruption, तो बहुत ही बड़ा एक उसका सतून है. ये पुरानी चीजें हैं. अगर आप मैं पढ़ रहा था कि अयूब खान के जब कू हुआ, तो अगले दिन न्यूयॉर्क टाइम्स में जब सरकार का एक बयान आया कि कू की वजह क्या थी, आप यकीन माने ऐसे लग रहा है कि इमरान खान बात कर रहा था. the corruption of our political classes, or hum aayenge or hum incorruptible, bilkul usi tarah ka rhetoric tha. So I think that the question here is a progressive alternative that is meaningfully both undergirded by, as Noaman has been saying, by wo log jinki hum baat kar rahe hain. And I think that is a, you know, I would like it more than anybody else for that process to be accelerated. But because, you know, over the last 30, 40 years, associations have been eroded, associational politics, and even ye jo naujawan jinki main baat kar raha tha, मतलब इमरान खान और पीटीआई में एक ये भी था, एक अजीब सा एक तस्वर था कि आप सियासत कर रहे हैं लेकिन सियासत को बुरा भला कह के सियासत कर रहे हैं. तो यू नो सियासत को और सियासत के तस्वर को और एक ऐसी सियासत जो कि यू नो एक सीरियस सब्सटैंशियल रिफॉर्म और उन लोगों पर मुश्तमिल हो, आई थिंक दैट वुड बी डिस्टिंक्ट इन इट्स कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन एंड इट्स एजेंडा. फिर भी कोई गारंटी तो नहीं है. बाकी तो you know, an Orwellian future is something that none of us necessarily can say we have a guarantee against. But you know, ऐसा तो नहीं हो सकता कि हम कोशिश न करें. And I think that is essentially what we have to sort of, that would be my response, is that we certainly have to continue to vest hope in the possibility कि ये जो नौजवान हैं उनको जब नजर आएगा कि नारों से कुछ भी नहीं होता और कोई substantial, serious, and Noaman has made a very important point कि अब एक नौजवान नस्ल में शायद वेस्ट में ज्यादा है, अब यहाँ पे आहिस्ता आहिस्ता आएगा. But you know, the very serious question of planetary future and survival, and Pakistan is one of the most climate change prone regions in the world. तो कहीं ना कहीं हमें इन चीजों पे सोचकर शायद कोई मतलब एक मीनिंगफुल मुतबादल हम बना सकें, और कोशिश हम करते रहेंगे. बाकी अब वक्त बताएगा, और उस वक्त भी मेरा ख्याल है जो भी हुकूमत करेगा, there always needs to be you know, a healthy democratic opposition to hold it to account. And I think that's the best long-term guarantee we have, that we don't end up with some kind of Orwellian dystopia.
If I can actually jump on that, and I don't know if this is optimistic in a sense. I think we have to be very critical of Orwell. Orwell जो लिखता था और जिस नजरिए से लिखता था, मेरे ख्याल में वो तरक्की पसंद नहीं था, बल्कि कहीं और था. शायद रुजत पसंद भी नहीं था, लेकिन पता नहीं क्या था. The critique of the you know, the idea of revolution or just new classes coming to power. So we can look at Prime Minister Imran Khan's government. कि नियत थी कि इमरान खान साहब की तो अच्छी होगी, but he says मैं फरिश्ते कहाँ से लाऊंगा. तो फरिश्ते तो नहीं लाए, उन्हीं शक्लों को वापस लाया उन्हें. It's a revolving door of this, you know, Shaukat Tareen, you know, God bless him, but he was the finance minister for a different political party before this. Who Abdul Hafiz Sheikh was somebody else's economic advisor before this. So we're not really talking about a change in the class structure or the class power in society. What does happen when class power shifts is that, yes, it's entirely possible कि जब नए तबकात आते हैं ताकत में या इक़्तिदार में कि there's you know, processes by which the logics of statecraft, the logic of adapting to a structurally unequal world economy introduces or deviates people from the original program. Sure. But that should not allow us to negate the substantial progress that was made in the Soviet Union, the substantial progress that was made in China. Or give you an example, मैं नेपाल में था, वहाँ पे भी एक माओइस्ट, आसिम साहब ने इंडिया के नक्सलाइट्स की mention की, माओइस्ट की mention की. In Nepal, there's a Maoist movement that fought a civil war from 1996 to 2006, and then came to power in elections in 2010, I believe, or 2008. And thereafter, you know, now you have a communist government in power in Nepal, and many of those Maoists are in power. And you talk to an average Nepali at this point, they'll probably say that not you know, as far as the exercise of power is concerned, things haven't changed. वही patronage, clientelism की politics, वही corruption, वही चीजें. इब्तिदा में जब ये लोग आए थे तो बेहतरी नजर आ रही थी थोड़ी सी in governance, लेकिन अब नहीं है. But if you go into and ask at base levels what happened and how things have changed. तो मैं बात कर रहा था नेपाल में कुछ लोग बैठे हुए थे, पत्थर तोड़ रहे थे हथौड़ों के साथ. And I asked them, like, what have things changed for you? And they said, look, before this we were untouchable. Before the People's War, we were untouchable. हमारे पास नौकरी के इतने opportunities नहीं थे. But as a consequence of the people's war, ये जो अछूत जात पात का जो चक्कर है ये काफी हद तक टूट गया है. इसके जो सबसे गलीज एस्पेक्ट्स थे, पहलू थे, वो कम हुए हैं, बल्कि बहुत इलाकों में खत्म हो गए हैं, क्योंकि जो जनजाति वहां पर कहलाते हैं, आदिवासी या जो kind of tribal or Dalit or untouchable populations literally had guns in their hands, and they were saying to the rich and to the privileged castes कि अब दिखाओ तुम, show us your power. So that shift in power is important. In many areas there was this kind of feudal idea of landed rule that we have. It existed, and the Maoists at base levels dismantled that. तो मैं जाके इंटरव्यू लिया मैंने एक erstwhile feudal lord का, और वो कह रहा था कि यार पुराने जमाने में कितना अच्छा था कि लोग हमारी बात मानते थे, अब तो हमारी बात कोई नहीं मानता. Right? Those things are not always quantifiable. Those things are not always perceptible in the halls of power, but those things are important, and those things are progressive, and those things are net gains for humanity. So yes, the new rulers in many ways look like the old rulers, but the things that they've achieved through struggle and popular struggle has changed the face of these societies in substantial ways. And that's not the best thing, but it's much better than what existed before. And I think we should not discount that. And I'm in there, but I have a lot more to say about China and the Soviet Union in particular.
Okay, let's take a couple more. Dr. Shahid and then Mazullah Khan. Dr. Shahid, we're having some trouble hearing you.
It was a wonderful session, and I'm happy. There's personally, I joined these groups or debates and discussion.
Assalamu alaikum. Is it my turn, or am I speaking out of turn?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Aasim and Noaman. Noaman at the very end actually talked about a shift in class power. So in countries like Pakistan, where we have a typical rent-seeking economy, so at best, it's actually a zero-sum game. So we see all the elite, that they are on the same page when it comes to protecting their own interests. Why are the poor so divided? Why don't they, for example, resort, for example, to a common struggle? What are the barriers? What do you think?
I've been trying to answer that question for about 25 years. Well, I mean, very briefly, I think that Pakistan is this is again a slightly different set of debates, but Pakistan has a very serious crisis of national identity, right? So to bring people together, especially we've been talking about underdeveloped peripheries and from colonial times, there's these are gaps, these are divides that need to be bridged, and that have in the past been bridged at different stages. But you know, if you look at, for instance, in recent times, let's look at the pink tide in Latin America, right, where you have sort of a pushback, or Nepal is a separate example. Maybe Noaman can speak to that himself, but also a very ethnically diverse country. But all of these sort of places have managed to develop some kind of national popular project based on the interests of ordinary people or excluded people, and I think we've struggled to do that. The last time we ever did that was a party that from 1973 onwards has been banned, which is the National Awami Party, right, which had reasonably solid representation across all of Pakistan's ethnic groups, and also had a transformative sort of economic and political program. And since then, even if you look at sort of electoral results, so look at 2018, you literally had a different party winning every different province. So there's no one sort of organization or political form or force that is able to transcend or to bring together these unevenly developed regions. So that would be my sort of just one point. There's many reasons, I think. We've also talked about the absence or of institutions at sort of at the molecular level, associations, students groups, and trade unions and peasant groups. That's another. There's many different sort of, I think, pieces of this puzzle, but I think, you know, the national question is one of them, which just to sort of add another bit. Maybe Noaman can also chip in here.
Yeah, I mean, certainly not with the, I think the wealth of experience that Aasim brings to this. I think he's really only offered as a surface level glimpse of the wealth of experience that Aasim has. But I do want to focus on the kind of local question a little bit. I think we can, I don't think it's fair to ask, why don't the poor organize themselves in that way? It's like, what, यानी हमने कौन सा तीर मारा है जो हम by हम I mean हम intellectuals जो हैं, हम जो दानिश्वर तबका, हमने कौन सा तीर मारा जो हम कह रहे हैं जिनके पास resources हैं ही नहीं, वो क्या तीर मारेंगे? But the most important resource that poor people have, obviously, is their numbers and the possibility for collective action. And why there's no collective action is a huge, first of all, we need to understand there is collective action. There's a lot of collective action in Pakistan. Pakistan अगर चल रहा है तो उसके दो वजह हैं मेरे ख्याल में, एक खुदा है और दूसरा जो है हमारे जो अवाम है जो पता नहीं कैसे इस मुल्क को चला रही है, right? So there's these two things. Pakistan का खुदा हाफिज, yes, but there's also the vast creativity of people working at local levels, supporting each other. Committees hain, ye system hai, wo system hai. There's a lot of that going on. But when poor people do look to organize or to take collective action, uske jo institutional channels hain, and you know, again, Aasim has literally written a book about this. It's called The Politics of Common Sense. It's channeled through certain patronage and clientelistic structures. I think what we have to think about, अगर हम 1960s or 70s के conjuncture को जाके देखते हैं जहाँ पर there was more collective action, part of that was driven by that moment, international moment that Aasim has talked about, not simply the question of modernization or state level development, but also the hegemonic status of socialism as an ideology and the importance of communist states nearby, which I think gave a lot of working class people, a lot of peasants, but also a lot of middle class intellectuals and alignment. Us mauke mein middle class intellectuals aligned with the poor and with working class and peasant movements. In our movement as a whole, middle class intellectuals, I'm talking about young students particularly, kuch lehrein nazar aa rahi hain in parts of Pakistan, but by and large, I think students in Pakistan now have a very individualistic ideology, not thinking about how can we take these skills and things that we've learned and move them towards collective action by organizing working class and peasant people. So I think at a micro level, there's a lot of cleavages हम कह सकते हैं, contradictions हम कह सकते हैं. एक महल्ले में आप जाके देख लें तो जो, I won't get into this in too much detail actually, but I think one thing that we do need is to think seriously, and this is a very economic question. It's a political economic question. It's a question of development. Is to think seriously about what it will take to produce independent organizations of workers and peasants, not simply political organizations, but also civil society organizations like unions, associations, but also a political expression of that, which you know, Aasim and others have tried to do in different ways. I'm sorry, I don't think I answered anything at all or added anything to what Aasim was saying.
All right, so we have one last question before we wrap up. Shakil Durrani Saab, please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Do you hear me? I just wish to make an observation. Can you hear me, everyone? Okay. I just want to make an observation. It was regarding something that was said a few minutes back about deliberately leaving certain areas undeveloped in the context of Waziristan. My observation is that maybe that's not a policy really of the government of Pakistan. One has heard of that happening during the British times, but here it's not a formal policy to leave Waziristan or tribal areas or parts of Balochistan undeveloped. But what is unmistakable, and I've been a political agent since 1974, so I've served when Mr. Bhutto was there, and right up to now, till I retired. But I've dealt extensively with the tribal areas. I just think there was rather a lot of apathy amongst the rulers, the presidents and prime ministers of Pakistan towards the tribal areas, except one, and that was Mr. Bhutto. Mr. Bhutto, in my mind, was the only prime minister or political leader who had a passion for developing the tribal areas. Maybe it had something to do with the events, disturbing events in Afghanistan in the early and the mid 70s, because Sardar Dawood was there. That could be one reason. But Mr. Bhutto would visit every tribal agency twice a year, at times once a year. And after that, I have not seen any president or prime minister even visit the tribal areas more than once in 5 years. So I think we have ignored our tribal areas. And just as we have ignored Balochistan far too long, Sartaj Aziz committee asked for 3% of the divisible pool for the tribal areas. Most provinces said no, they are not going to provide that. Now, even though the tribal areas and the tribesmen have suffered the most in the last 40 years, but no one really is pushed. And this is really sad. I think we need to do a lot more for the tribal areas and a lot more for Balochistan. Well, one can talk of how to get it done. Maybe this is not the forum for that, but this is just an observation on this issue which was raised earlier. Thank you.
So I think Shakil Saab raises a really important point. I think it's important to understand that at least when I say that there's been underdevelopment in tribal areas in FATA, it's not to say that there has not been development there. Underdevelopment does not mean lack of development or lack of an attempt at development. Underdevelopment means that the processes and the structures through which development is pursued ends up producing what we can call perverse outcomes. I think Shakil Saab is absolutely correct that these areas have not simply been neglected, or at least there is a time when there is neglect. But if you, there's a researcher, her name is Alia Qaim, and she's done some work on what development has looked like, political economy of development in FATA. And it's really interesting to look at her work. So absolutely what Shakil Saab is saying is correct, that under Bhutto, you see that state investment, developmental expenditures in FATA increase. But what's interesting is that during Zia's time, those expenditures don't decrease, they increase even more. At least in nominal terms, maybe not in real terms, but certainly in nominal terms, the development expenditure in FATA increases. What happens in the 1990s is a little bit of a gray area. Nobody really knows because a lot of the development expenditure in Pakistan overall decreases as a consequence of structural adjustment programs. And then again in 2000s, you'll see that the development expenditure after the war on terror increases again in FATA. So it's not that money is not being spent in FATA. The question is, who does that end up benefiting? What kinds of structural transformations does that induce? And what ends up happening is that there's, as Aasim said, it's not that these areas are not endowed. Immense natural resource endowments, immense labor endowments, immense human creativity. But all of that is structured towards the benefits of a small number of people in these areas. And then if there's some trickle-down benefits, that's a different question. And in some ways that reflects the overall picture of Pakistan, but it has its specificities, that underdevelopment is maintained in these areas, not through neglect, but rather through conscious decisions of policymakers, of bureaucrats, of politicians, because this is their way of making profits from these areas. So again, certainly Bhutto Saab had his own drives in a certain moment, but since then, at least, it's not, I don't think we should understand that these areas have been neglected. They've not been neglected at all. But rather the kinds of investments that are going there are benefiting some people at the expense of most people. And that needs to be understood, I think. So thank you for raising that point.
Thank you.
Very important.
Thank you.
Dr. Aasim, would you like to add anything?
I'll just say very briefly, I do think that there's a lot that one could say here. I think that there is a political economy of regions like Balochistan or the ex-FATA areas, which generally is underspecified. There is stuff going on. It's not as if people there are not finding ways to meet their needs. And so, for instance, in FATA, I think we've not really studied this, and I think that's something that people with a backbone ought to be doing, is looking at the political economy of war, because war makes money, and war is a form of accumulation, and war, that area has been beset by war for 40 years. I think so. There's definitely something there for us to talk about, and maybe this is not the time. But those are the kinds of things that we bring into focus that inevitably, as always, will, as we've talked about throughout this couple of hours, always makes clear that development is always, or a lack of it, or a particular kind of it, or war, or reconstruction, even, as we've just seen, if after 20 years in Afghanistan, the kinds of money that were made in the name of reconstruction. These are always political matters.
Wonderful, wonderful. And with that, I believe we are at the end of the session. I'd like to express my gratitude to Dr. Aasim, Dr. Noaman for taking out the time today, enlightening us, highlighting our blind spots as economists. I really appreciate it. This has been very insightful. And I also want to apologize on behalf of Dr. Nadeem, who couldn't make it today. He had to leave for Lahore on an urgent basis. So apologies for that. But I'd like to extend an open invitation to you folks. Drop by PIDE at any time, whenever you'd like. I know, Dr. Noaman, you're in Toronto, but perhaps we can set up an e-meet with you at some point. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
Thank you, Vas. Thank you very much.